Hello. Thank you for your patience. I'm excited to welcome you to Justice for Whom? 9/11 and the Legacy of the War on Terror. Actually, I apologize. Let me make sure that the captioning is working. Okay, the captioning should be working for anyone needing captions. Yes. Again, my name is David Vine. I am a professor of political anthropology in the Department of Anthropology at American University. I want to thank the Department of Anthropology and its chair, Rachel Watkins, as well as our senior administrative assistant, Jeannie Wogeman, College of Arts and Sciences, everyone in the Department of Anthropology community, and many others at American University for helping to make this event possible. Again, thank you to all of you who are joining us this evening. And for those of you watching the recording later, which is, again, to inform you that we are recording. And by participating, you are, of course, consenting to the recording. An event focused on the last 22 years of US wars, as well as the legacy of those wars, and efforts to bring justice to the victims of war. I want to pay homage to the victims of many, many prior US wars, dating to the independence of the United States. There's sadly not enough time to read the names of all the peoples and countries with whom the US government has fought, but they include, for example, Panama, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Haiti, Korea, the Dominican Republic, Hawaii, Mexico, and the many, many indigenous peoples and nations that are the original inhabitants of the land on which American University, here in what we now know as Washington, D.C., and in the rest of the United States, where many of us sit, with whom the US military has fought wars, including the Piscataway, Pamunkey, the Nacotchtank Anacostans, the Muskegee, the Cherokee, the Cheyenne, the Sioux, and many, many more. And I should note that this partial list of the more than 135 peoples and countries with whom the US military has fought since US independence, that this list does not include the victims of US-backed coups in places like Chile, Iran, or Honduras. In this event, we're going to hear from four terrific scholars and scholar activists: Anila Dalautzai, Maha, Hilal, Katalina, Khoury, and Jennifer Walkup Jays. I'm very honored and pleased to say that Maha, Katalina, and Jenny are all graduates of American University, and it's a thrill to be able to have them back here with us. I'm going to ask each of them two questions, and then they'll speak for a few minutes each in response to the two questions. And then we're going to open up the conversation to all of you, the audience, for questions and answers and discussion. Encourage you to add questions in the chat at any point during the presentations, the responses to the questions that I'm going to pose at the beginning. And then later during the formal Q&A period, people will be able to use the Zoom raise hand function or button to get my attention so that I can call on you, and then allow people to unmute themselves and ask questions verbally. But throughout, including during that period, people can add questions in the chat as well, which then I or someone else will read. Before we do those introductions, let me try to provide just some quick context. Actually, let me hold off on that and instead introduce you to our great panelists tonight, because they're fantastic, and I'd rather you begin to hear their voices now. Anila Dalautzai, can you tell us a little about yourself? We decided this is a much more fun way to introduce people than for me to read what would be very esteemed CVs, but it's more fun to hear the introductions from the voices of our speakers tonight themselves. So Anila, do you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm based in Oakland, California. I'm affiliated with UC Berkeley and UC Santa Cruz. I have been working on Afghanistan for more than 30 years. So I was in Afghanistan in 1995 with the first Taliban regime, and I have worked as a socio-cultural, so political and medical anthropologist in Afghanistan for the past too many years. So any questions that are specific to the war in Afghanistan, I also work in Pakistan, particularly the border areas of Pakistan. So, and I'm quite familiar with that area as well. So if anyone has questions specific to that, I can certainly take them. Thank you all for being here, and I look forward to learning and thinking with all of you.
Thank you so much, Anila. Katalina, Khoury, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Katalina Khoury. I'm currently based in Brooklyn, New York, and work as a special education teacher at a school called Uncommon Schools. I also have a degree, BA and MA degree in anthropology from American University. I'm really happy and honored to be here alongside Anila, Maha. Thank you, Professor Vine, for inviting me here, and Jenny as well.
Thank you, Professor Khoury. Jenny, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Sure. As everyone has said, thank you so much for having us. It's nice to see Katalina again. We were students at AU in the master's program at the same time. During and sort of towards the end of my master's program, did research focusing on non-military approaches to counterterrorism, and I'm the author of a paper on that topic. Since graduating, I have been working as a program manager at a nonprofit in Pittsburgh that serves refugees, immigrants, and migrants here in this community.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And Maha, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So echoing thanks to David for bringing this panel together. So I'm Maha Hilal. I am with the Muslim Counterpublics Lab, which is an organization that seeks to disrupt and subvert dehumanizing narratives that are designed and deployed to justify state violence against Muslims. I'm also the author of the book Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. And finally, I am an adjunct professor this semester at American University, which is where I got my PhD.
Yay, thank you so much, Maha. We're still getting people coming and joining us. We're just getting underway. And again, I'm going to provide just a little bit of context, and then, as I mentioned, ask each of the panelists a few questions, 2 questions, to which they'll respond, and then we will open things to Q&A and a discussion with the audience, which we're all very much looking forward to. Just want to share my screen to share a few images. So I think for technical reasons, it'll be easier just to convey the context I want to convey this way. In this event, we're going to focus on the last 22 years of US-led wars. Been hearing some talk this week of the 22nd anniversary of the attacks of 9/11, of the US military and others moving on beyond 9/11. I think we think that, and beyond the wars that followed, I think we believe that that would be entirely inappropriate for a whole range of reasons. In the past 22 years of US-led wars that the US government has waged after al-Qaeda's attacks on September 11th, 2001, many know that the United States waged wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. But of course, the United States government waged less well-known wars in a total of at least 25 countries, including Pakistan, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, the Philippines, Burkina Faso, and far beyond. During these wars, as some in the United States are all too aware, around 15,000 US military personnel died. That includes uniformed US military personnel and US military contractors. Many hundreds of thousands more suffered serious injuries. We will never know the total death toll in the countries where the US government has launched and waged its wars in the past 22 years. The best estimate, coming from the Costs of War Project, Brown University, is that in Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, and Syria alone, the total death toll for all civilians and military personnel from all nations is somewhere around 4.5 to 4.6 million people. And that could be a dramatic undercount. 4.5 to 4.6 million people. Tens of millions have been injured in these and other countries. As we'll hear later from Katalina, Khoury in particular, tens of millions have been displaced. The US government has already spent, and that is US taxpayers have already spent, or will come to spend, more than $8 trillion. $8 trillion on the post 9/11 wars. And that's just as of fiscal year 2022, the last fiscal year before the current one. The current total surely is around $9 trillion or more. And we should ask and must ask what else we could have done with that money. How many more deaths could have been prevented if the United States government had spent even a small portion of that $8 trillion elsewhere. Now, of course, these numbers, 4.5 million deaths, $8 trillion, they are so large as to be numbing, which I think is particularly problematic, dangerous, troubling when we're talking about deaths. It's very difficult to wrap one's brain around 4.5 million deaths, 4.5 million killed. One way comes from my colleague in the history department, Peter Kuznick. Most are familiar with the Vietnam War Memorial here in Washington, D.C., which lists the names, of course, of US military personnel killed in that war, more than 58,280 names. Peter and many others, of course, point out that the wall omits the names of the estimated 4 to 5 million Vietnamese, Lao, and Cambodians who died, as well as people from other countries who fought in the US-led wars in Southeast Asia. The Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C. is 492 feet long with its 58,280 odd names, 492 feet long. With all the 4 to 5 million names, the wall would be 8 miles long. It's telling then that the 4.5 million estimated to have died, to have been killed in the US-led post 9/11 wars, just the most violent of them, is a similar number, of a similar magnitude. 8 miles worth of names. The Irish poet Padraig O'Tuama, in a poem, The Pedagogy of Conflict, also has been helpful to me in trying to make sense of 4.5 million dead in the post 9/11 wars. When in part of his poem, The Pedagogy of Conflict, he writes, "When I was a child, I learned to count to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But these days, I've been counting lives. So I count 1 life, 1 life, 1 life, 1 life, 1 life. Because each time is the first time that that life has been taken." With that, let me ask Jenny Walkup Jays to take us over from here and be the first to respond to our first question. Given that most of the people attending or watching this event, certainly many of them, were not even alive on September 11th, 2001, and the start of the so-called War on Terror that followed in the days after, as well as not being alive during many of the early years of the wars that followed, including the beginning of the US-led war in Iraq that began in 2003. Given that most people weren't alive for these events, what's the most important thing that people should know about these wars and their enduring legacies and your work related to the wars?
Thank you. For me, related to my research, and I think that there are perhaps more important things to know about the War on Terror than this, because as you say, each life, each person, each culture, each community is itself a powerful story and an important thing to know about. So I apologize for being so logical here, but that's what I'm going to do. The most important thing to know about these wars related to my research is that they were not inevitable. We have a public discourse that so often assumes that after the attacks on September 11th, the US had no choice but to go to war. And that's not actually the case. The decision to launch the War on Terror was a decision, and it was a decision that actually broke with international and domestic precedent for how we handle acts of terror. So prior to September 11th, the US government had treated terrorism as a crime, and it had primarily addressed that crime through arrest and trial. After all, most acts of terrorism, kidnapping, bombing, hijacking, these are things that are already illegal. This criminal justice or law enforcement approach was the domestic norm. It had been used, for example, in 1995 when the Oklahoma City bomber killed 168 people and destroyed a federal building. He was arrested, he was made to stand trial. It was also the international norm. It had been successful in quelling groups acting on the global stage. For instance, in the 1970s, the Japanese Red Army faction had staged attacks at a Tel Aviv airport, an oil refinery in Singapore, French, US, and Swedish embassies, and they were able to successfully address the problem by arresting and prosecuting the people responsible for those attacks. So the days after 9/11 were this moment of paradigm shift, where we were shifting from a criminal justice model to a war paradigm. And thinking of counterterrorism as a war doesn't actually quite make sense. Terrorism is a tactic. It's not a type of person. It's not a country. You can't win a war against a tactic. There's not even an agreed upon definition of what terrorism is. If you open a Terrorism 101 textbook, basically the first chapter is going to be like terrorism, the definitional problem, because there is no agreed upon definition. In 2008, different US governments and offices were using more than 20 different, sometimes competing definitions. Between 1982 and 2004, the US Department of State had changed its definition at least 7 times. When people say terrorist, they never mean the same thing. It can mean anything from an insurgent group fighting a government to an individual actor. And sort of colloquially, many of us understand terrorism as something that targets civilian, not military or government targets. Not all definitions require that either. Because it is so loosely and poorly defined, and everyone kind of agrees that terrorism is bad, the label of terrorist so frequently gets used to discredit political enemies and to authorize the use of state violence against them. It is often used in racialized and really Islamophobic ways. I think the most useful definition is one that zeroes in on terrorism as a tactic. It's a tactic of political violence, where the target is symbolic, right? It inspires a psychological response among a broader community, not just those who were immediately affected. But if you understand terrorism as a tactic, you have to recognize that there's a difference between the act of terror and the group or person that commits it. Groups and people can start using terrorism at any time, and groups can also switch to nonviolence. It's not an immutable state of being. When I started this research, I had a really hard time imagining what a non-military version of counterterrorism could look like. The war on terror had been going on for most of my life, and I had a very hard time imagining an alternative. Thankfully, there have been some studies that have examined databases of terror groups across history and looked at why they ended. And these studies, for the most part, show that war is one of the worst possible ways to handle terrorism. Only 7% of terror groups across history ended as a result of military intervention. And the most common ways that groups end are 43% of the time becoming a political party, and 40% of the time because of domestic policing. So to be clear, this is not new information either. The research that I'm citing was first published by RAND in 2008. It was commissioned by the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So if in 2008, the leaders of the US military knew that warfare is not an effective tool for counterterrorism, what are we doing continuing to fight a war on terror? And I think the answer is that counterterrorism is not actually the driving factor behind this war or these wars. It's an excuse.
Annie, thank you so much for kicking us off. I think I'll now turn to Katalina Khoury. Kat, could you take us away in answering the same question, given that most people don't have any memory, most people in the United States have no memory of 9/11 or the early days of the war, so-called war on terror. What's the most important thing for people to know, and what's the most important thing from your research that people should know about?
I think the most important thing is that we should really consider what the long-term impacts of war. You are destabilizing countries, you are uprooting people from their social fabrics, and a lot of these impacts are just completely disregarded. If somebody, for example, let's say a lot of our, first of all, a lot of our measurements are about deaths and injuries, but we're not measuring these long-term variables that are impacting the quality of life of people. If certain people are drinking contaminated water, that affects the quality of their life, and that could even shorten their life. But our measurement tools are not taking those factors into consideration. So when we talk about war, we need to think about what we're doing to the quality of life of the people that are being impacted, these innocent people who are just in that war zone. And that plays into our paper on displacement and all of the intergenerational trauma that we are imparting on these people. And that matters. These things matter. And if we're going to even consider, like, we have to be more mindful about our choices. What are the motivators? Why are we being so reactive about just jumping into a war? And yeah, there are invisible impacts. And I think what we've been doing in this paper was so important in making these impacts a little bit more visible.
Thank you so much, Katalina. Anila, can you, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the initial question.
Thank you so much, Katalina and Jenny and David. So the initial question, I know the heart of the question wanted us to go back to the start of the war for those that were not born at that time or too young or otherwise. I actually want to start more recently, just to dispel some of the myths that have occurred in your lifetimes and in your sort of critical intellectual awareness, to show the extent of the myth making, particularly with regards to the war in Afghanistan. So first, besides taking into account what Katalina and Jenny have spoken about in terms of the afterlives of wars, right? That there's continuing damage and harm that doesn't figure into those calculations. That does, there's things that happened even beyond death to the corpses, right? They're continuing to be assaulted, whether it's environmentally or otherwise, right? So besides that, right? Don't let anyone convince you or make you believe that the war in Afghanistan is over. It's not. And it currently takes the form of the starvation of more than 75, conservative estimates, 75% of the Afghan population is currently being starved. And that's to credit to the US government and its decisions, right? So that's one thing, right? So don't let anyone let you believe that the war, the 9/11 wars, but particularly the war in Afghanistan, is over. It is not. Two, the language around the Taliban, that they the Taliban took over, right? Don't let anyone convince you of that either. The Taliban was installed. It was a agreement that was made in Doha over 2 years, and that was planned and orchestrated, right? So the Taliban is there and in power because the US put them there, right? The Afghan people did not. 3, what we all saw in August 2021, or what most of us saw with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, made many people comment that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was really chaotic and horrifying, including the drone attack that happened in Kabul. And it was very chaotic. The drone attack killed actually 7 children, 10 in total people. They were all civilians. The initial thought was there was somebody that was a terrorist, but he was not. He was a humanitarian transporting water, right? So even culminating in that final, it wasn't the final drone attack because there was more drone attacks after that, but that attack that we all saw and were aware of, don't let anyone think that just the withdrawal was chaotic. The entire 22 years of war, 20 years of war in Afghanistan were chaotic, much less the prior years of US involvement, right? So, you know, for commentators just to say, oh, it was horrible, it was a mess, you know, and I'm no fan of Biden, right? Certainly no fan of Trump either, but to relegate it to just the withdrawal, the entire war was like that. Civilians were killed mercilessly throughout the entire war, simply for what they were wearing, for the languages they were speaking, etc. Right? So I just want to make that clear. Those are just a few points that start more contemporary. I can certainly entertain any questions people have going back to the beginning of this US war in Afghanistan, but also keep in mind that the US war in Afghanistan goes back into the 70s, and I would even argue to the 50s. Thank you.
Anila, thank you. That was really beautifully and succinctly and powerfully put. Maha, do you want to take us away with this first question?
Yeah, so thank you, Anila, thank you, Katalina, and thank you, Jenny, for your remarks. I think, especially Anila, that was just really helpful to think about how even the contemporary context still continues to be laced with the same problems of how the war on terror began. So I just want to quick reflect on a speech that Biden gave this past week on Monday, which was the 22nd anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. And in this speech, I'm just going to read a quick excerpt. He said, quote, "What is the soul of America? It is the breath, the life, the essence of who we are. A soul is what makes us, quote, us. The soul of America is based on a sacred proposition that we are all created equal, endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Obviously, in our discussion, right, we can see how this is not a value for all people. This is only a value that the United States applies to its citizens. The United States does not value life outside of who is in this country. And even in saying that, we have to parse it out even further, right? Because Black and brown people in this country are also not treated with equality, equity, dignity, and respect. So as Anila said, the war in Afghanistan is not over, and the war on terror at large is not over. Biden kept repeating this when there was a US withdrawal from Afghanistan, whatever that means. But there's an important question here. If we say that the war is over, who is it over for? It's easy to say that when you're in the United States. And people here don't bear the daily brunt of violence and war, and the fear of war, the precarity of war, right? There's this quote that I often love to say because it's really powerful. It's very depressing, but it's really powerful and poignant. And it's from a congressional hearing where a young Pakistani boy who's 13 years old said, quote, "I no longer love blue skies. In fact, I now prefer gray skies. The drones do not fly when the skies are gray." The fact that this young boy, who's 13 years old, associates the color of the sky with the probability of violence means the war is not over, right? What would it mean if kids in Afghanistan, in Somalia, and Yemen, all the places where the US is droning and killing and murdering civilians, would not have to worry literally about the color of the sky, predicting whether they or their families are going to meet death later that day? What would that mean? So a lot of you are younger in this room, right? I was 18 when the 9/11 attacks happened. And although I wasn't particularly politicized or very cognizant of my identity as a Muslim and Arab, I automatically knew that there was going to be collective responsibility when it was revealed who the 9/11 attackers were. And so the war on terror is also not over, right? Until young people, young Muslims, young Arabs, right? Young Afghans, young Pakistanis don't somehow instinctively know that that will be the case. Should there be an act of violence perpetrated by someone who shares the same identity as they do? Much of my work revolves around and centers the role of Islamophobia in the war on terror. And even in liberal and progressive spaces, maybe it's not a surprise for a lot of you in this room, there's this idea that the targeting of Muslims was either unintended or coincidental, as opposed to being intentional, brutal, and very targeted. There's no doubt about it. So if we want to talk about dismantling and abolishing the war on terror, we have to simultaneously talk about Islamophobia in the war on terror and what it means to dismantle this system of oppression. And then I just want to make a couple more points, and I want to be succinct here. And I know Jenny brought up the various definitions of terrorism. To me, it's important, right, that the state continues to redefine what terrorism is or is not. But it's also the fact that at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Like many other policies and laws and whatever is governing counterterrorism, it doesn't matter. Small linguistic changes are not going to impact the trajectory of the violence that this country is going to choose to take. It's not as if one change in the word of the definition of terrorism is really going to shift the use of violence. And then one other point is that, oftentimes when we look at political violence, there's this chart that I've seen numerous times from New America Foundation, and it was tracking what it called jihadist violence versus non-jihadist violence, i.e. white supremacist violence. In other words, distinctly tethering violence to a particular group of people and essentially making it the gold standard. The gold standard is violence committed by Muslim, and everything else is in comparison to that violence, as if the violence in this country isn't organic and deeply rooted in its foundation. And then finally, thinking about state violence, the idea of state violence as morally superior. Why do we continue to promote and believe that idea? State violence is not morally superior to non-state actor violence. State violence is catastrophic, and it's more destructive than non-state actor violence. And this is not about justifying violence. It's about understanding and holding people accountable, holding governments accountable, who continuously wage state violence on populations across the globe.
Thank you so much, Maha. Really, again, powerful words from all four of you. And Maha spoke about the need to dismantle Islamophobia as part of a larger effort to dismantle the so-called war on terror, which nicely takes us into the second question, where I've asked everyone to reflect a bit more briefly so we can move to questions and engagement with the audience soon. And again, let me encourage people to begin adding your questions to the chat at any point, or to write them down, and then we can call on folks to use their voice to ask their questions momentarily. But Jenny, let me turn to you again to begin our conversation about how we can move toward justice. We've titled this event Justice for Whom? How can we as individuals and collectivities, as people belonging to groups, or in any fashion, move toward any semblance of justice?
I'm sure this is not what you perhaps want to hear. I have a very hard time feeling that justice is possible here. The amount of horror that has been wrought, the intergenerational trauma. You know, I work every day with refugees. Most of them, well, half of them are Afghan, a significant number are from Syria, and many of them are desperately trying to get their families out of a very bad situation. They're sending as much money as they possibly can to keep people fed. I don't think that there's anything that can be done to undo what the US government has done and what we have done. But I do think there are things we can do to make sure it doesn't happen again or stop it from continuing to happen. I think that in a sort of national level, we need to be talking about security very differently. I don't think that security should be about borders or countries. The things that actually keep people safe are having jobs, having communities, having family, having enough food, being loved, having a doctor. And when people feel like they are comfortable, like they can have a full life, like they can have a voice in the public sphere, they're much less likely to do the sort of interpersonal violence that we're seeing growing in the United States right now. And as Maha pointed out, the violence of the state is so much larger than what any sort of extremist group has done. There was a statistic that really surprised me. START, which is a terrorism database, had looked at the number of US citizens killed in terror attacks between 1995 and 2019. You will note that includes 2001. And the number they have was 3,455. In the United States, 45,000 people die each year because they do not have health care. So when we're talking about security, and this, you know, should be taken much more broadly than US citizens. I'm not meaning to say that US citizens are the be all end all, but it's sort of the number I have in front of me. We need to be talking about actual human safety and security and not this borders nations thing.
Powerfully put. Thank you. Katalina, do you want to take on this question of what any measure of justice might look like and where we might go, how we might work together to build something that might look like justice or some semblance of it?
I definitely echo what Jenny just said. I also don't know what kind of a what would amount to justice for those affected by this war. Where my mind personally goes is that I feel like this country has some serious, like the people who run this country, the people who run corporations, people, members of government, I don't think that they are well. I think our country needs to do some serious healing work and truly, and that's kind of where I've been at in the last couple of years, especially since COVID. Personally, I had to kind of tap out of the, you know, the media firestorm that was just, I feel like, hijacking people's emotional states. And so I think bringing it back to community and just really looking inward, and, you know, if we can create true community bonds, true connection, and learn to really listen to other people who have different opinions as us, and come at it from a really like devoted place of wanting to listen and be present and share that feeling and that connection, I think that is truly, if we do that on a micro level, it just amounts to a big systemic change. And that's the best I can really say about anything that's all, you know, I've always been against interventionism. So, but you can't really, it's not black and white like that either. So that's the best I can offer.
I think that's really helpful and complementary with what Jenny said. I am loving how the four of you are complementing each other so nicely and helpfully. Anila, do you want to take on the justice question?
Yeah, as a practicing Muslim, I believe in perhaps non-secular forms of justice that will reign. In this world, as it currently is constructed, I don't see anything that even resembles secular forms of justice manifesting. Given that, and that's that's how both Katalina and Jennifer started as well. Given that, people need to connect the abolish police movement and the violence of the police state here with the wars. Right, so it needs to be abolish the police and abolish war and the military-industrial complex, right? And those need to be hand in hand and not separate from the climate, not separate from all of the other massive issues that are facing us. Because, you know, if we even want to just focus on climate and be a climate activist, the #1 polluter is the US military, right? So for starters, it would be to encourage everyone to join abolition circles in their neighborhoods, in their intellectual spheres. If you don't know them, get to know them immediately. 2 is, I'll also preface this with the fact that it's just not going to happen, because it hasn't happened for the historical injustices done to Black people or Indigenous people in this country. Instead, there's a movement to actually, you know, abolish their histories of struggle and disenfranchisement from the creation of America, right? That's getting massive backing across the country. But there needs to be reparations for Afghans. So the US government and even some activists have focused on helping Afghans that helped US empire and the military in Afghanistan as the ones that are the rightful recipients of special immigrant visas. Any Afghan that wants to leave Afghanistan should be handed any passport in the world that they want on a plate. Their educations, if they want to be educated to whatever level, if they want 10 PhDs, it should be paid for, as far as I'm concerned. The level of reparations that are owed not only to this generation, but prior generations because of US policy is immense, right? So we can go on about the Taliban's no education for women, right? And if the US was actually horrified and the rest of the world about it, then admit every Afghan free of cost, right? I'm working with Afghans that are scattered throughout California, right? That are living literally like with the worst. I mean, they're just waiting for the US government to give them any semblance of like security, financial security. And the one thing I helped, I supported because I taught in Afghanistan for 4 years. So I had many students and others that needed help and support getting out in August 2021. Right. And the first thing I told them, I said, do not come to the United States. I know exactly, given what I know as somebody who was born and raised in the United States, I know exactly what they're going to do. They're going to turn their backs on Afghans one more time or yet again. Right. And you will be high and dry. I did everything to get them into every other country except the United States. And when I do the work with families in the Bay Area, it's just atrocious what they're facing, the insecurity. You have, you know, the US government made $19 million on applications submitted by Afghans since August 2021, right? 44,000 Afghans submitted applications, paid the enormous fees right? Many of us, Afghans and others, were raising money to pay these enormous visa fees. 19 million the US government made in profit. They only admitted 144 Afghans out of the 45,000 applications. There's a study been done, it's documented, it's very clear data. So the US profited, made 19 million. You have Afghans, like last week, there was a young Afghan woman that committed suicide in Pakistan because of the precarious situation. Afghans are treated like fifth-class citizens in Pakistan and have been, right? So the Pakistan state is not a comforting place for Afghans, right? And because they're waiting on US visas, she couldn't wait anymore. She was not being admitted to Pakistan universities, which is pretty standard, like Pakistan policy. And she killed herself, right? So the one big fallacy, and this is not coming from somebody who supports the Taliban, but for people to understand the magnitude of how we've been fooled, is everyone thinks that the worst thing that has happened to Afghans is the Taliban. And that's just not true. They're a piece of the larger problem, which the US played no small role in creating. The US supported and funded the Taliban, installed them in 2021, right? So for us to talk about the lack of education for Afghan women and oh my God, they're horrible. The US created the Taliban, funded them throughout the 80s, right? And made them powerful and installed them in 2021. Right, so let's not forget about that. So for me, reparations to any Afghan for any passport they want around the world. I'm not sure why they would want to come to the United States, but if they have some fantasy to come to the United States, it should be like, you know, they should have complete job security when they come here. They should be able to pursue anything that they want, not the precarity that they have had to experience as asylum seekers and evacuee statuses because they don't have any status. So for me, it's pretty clear, and it sounds radical, but it is really pretty basic. Yeah, any Afghan should be allowed to leave the country and get any passport in the world they want and get their entire education paid for starters.
Thank you so much, Anila. Thank you for making it so concrete and practical. Maha, love to hear your thoughts about the question of moving toward justice.
So I think, like, you know, all the panelists, I share a lot of skepticism in terms of what justice means. But I think the first piece of this, right, is that there has to be acknowledgement of wrongdoing. And without that acknowledgement, there cannot be justice. And the United States has demonstrated time and time again that they will not hold themselves accountable. And no one can hold the United States accountable. For those of you who may not know this, there is a fund that the US has that's for victims of state-sponsored terrorism. And it has issued billions of dollars to the families and victims of the 9/11 attacks, which is a good thing, right? People need to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of violence. But what this fund demonstrates, really, the message behind this fund and the lack of creating another fund for the victims of US wars, is to say that only our victims deserve compensation and acknowledgement. And that's a problem, right? Because again, if there is no accountability, there is no justice. And if we're not even willing to acknowledge the destruction and devastation that we've caused in countries across the globe, what does that mean for justice? Also, what about asking the victims of US wars and violence, what does justice mean to you? Perhaps they also don't believe there will be justice, but it doesn't have to be an abstract exercise about what is justice. Ask the people whose families you've killed, who you've droned, who you've bombed. What does justice mean to you? I also think of, for example, Guantanamo survivors, because I have done a lot of work on closing Guantanamo and supporting the men who've been transferred out of that prison. And even when one of the men or any of the men are held for numerous years without charge or conviction, and 6 agencies in the government, US government, gather to decide on whether or not to transfer the person out of the prison. When they do, they basically come up with a statement saying, this person is no longer a significant threat to the United States. What does that mean? That means they go back to either their home country or a third-party country with the stigma of terrorism forever stamped on their backs. So that's how far the US is from justice. It won't even take responsibility for these people who they acknowledge, right, in transferring them. They did not have enough evidence or any evidence at all to detain and torture them. And that's a problem. There have been rare occasions where the United States has offered compensation to civilians in countries where it has, combat or wars. But again, it doesn't actually come with acknowledgement of wrongdoing. I'm not exactly sure how they disconnect that. And everyone knows it's for that. But at the same time, it's still undergirded by, we are justified in committing the violence that we have committed. And then the last thing I'll say is, this is sort of interesting sort of piece of the puzzle, which is that for 5 of the men who are in military commissions at Guantanamo, there's been heavy involvement from some of the 9/11 families. There's a broad spectrum in terms of their political perspectives. But it's just interesting, right? Because typically in the US's legal system, victims are not actually incorporated to this large of an extent in terms of how they want the outcome of the perpetrators to happen. And I mention this because it's often been the case that the US, on top of all the other violence, weaponizes the 9/11 families towards their ends of perpetuating further injustice, making justice even more nebulous. So I think, I'll just stop there and say that, we can talk about justice and we should talk about justice, but imagine a world where justice was never having been exposed to or facing systemic state violence. What if that was justice? What if injustice was the exception, not the norm, when it comes to Muslims and other marginalized communities in the war on terror?
Thank you so much, Maha, both for your specific suggestions in the context of the post 9/11 wars and for giving us a vision of justice in a longer term and in the world we want to build moving forward, or many of us want to build moving forward. I'd like to invite everyone in the audience to ask questions now of any or all of our panelists. Again, you can do it by placing your question in the chat or by using the raise hand function or button, and I will then call on folks. As people are getting their questions together, for those tuning in live, I will also put a link to the paper that Katalina, Khoury referenced, the Creating Refugees paper that documented an estimated 38 million displaced people in the 8 most violent wars the United States government has participated in since 2001, as well as a graphic depicting the movement of those 38 million estimated to have been displaced in the post 9/11 wars. We have a question from Maria. You should be able to unmute yourself now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Indeed, yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. That was amazing. I'm a little bit speechless, and angry at the situation, but thank you for all the insight. It was really amazing. My question is for Anila. So I work, I'm actually Jenny's colleague, but my role in the organization is with pregnant refugee women. And so since 2021, I've been working with a lot of Afghan women that arrived pregnant or have become pregnant since. So I think I have observed the double difficulties and chaos of arriving in such a traumatic way, and then going through pregnancy in the United States while experiencing poverty and the stress. It's a lot. And so I think I've gotten to observe a little about how, well, a lot actually, about how the body responds to intergenerational trauma and violence and things like that. Body and physical and mental health is my focus. While I try to show up for the moms and the children, and in general, like, I can see how it's affecting the generations that are coming, and of course how it's affected by the generations before, and a lot of obstetric trauma and things like that. And I know you said that you're a medical anthropologist, so I was curious, like, what are some patterns, I guess, you have observed over all your years focusing on Afghanistan about, like, the way trauma, this violence shows up in the body, but also then some patterns that maybe you've seen about, like, positive things that have helped people heal or make the symptoms less bad. Particularly, I have some people that have really severe symptoms that doctors name as psychosomatic, and things that doctors can't help with, and that, you know, we try to help with company and building a good relationship. But I wonder what more is there, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much, Maria. Anila, do you want to take that?
Thank you, Maria, for your question and for all the work that you're doing, not just for Afghans, but your work sounds very, very important. And I applaud you for it. You know, the toll of intergenerational trauma, particularly with Afghans, we're not even close to being able to assess that or figure that out, right? There's been serial war for 43 years, right? And lives lived as refugees and then refugeed later in their life, right? Where they were refugees when they were children, they returned to Afghanistan, never did they think they would be refugees again, and yet they are, and their children are, right? So that does something very different to the psyche of Afghans. I'm trying to work on a project for myself that looks at just the work on the psyche of Afghans of serial war and violence, right? It is easy to give them psychosomatic disorders and labels, whether it's post-traumatic stress disorder, and they're useful in some ways, but they're not useful in too many other ways. Right, so my answer is not going to be very helpful, right? But one thing that I would encourage you and others that you work with who work with Afghans to think through is, right, is we've all been sort of disciplined into languages of resilience, right? That resilience is a great thing. It's about the strength that comes from the person, and right, because they just keep on going, right? The mother still gives birth, she's somehow still able. There's great resilience. And I would I resist resilience in my writing and in my work, right? Because it just means that it's part of this neoliberal regime of like productivity. Like no matter what violence is done to you, you just have to keep, keep getting up, right? Keep, and so for me that the languages of resilience, especially by non-Afghans, to me is a form of violence, right? So while it might seem like it's helpful in talking to, Afghan women or pregnant Afghan women, right? It's not, it's a form of violence, right? Because it just, no matter what happens to you, you just have to keep doing what needs to be done so your child is healthy and so, right? And it's just a really, like I said, not only is it unrealistic, but it's wrong, because no matter what people do to you, you just have to keep being the strong one, or the one that keeps having to do what's in front of you, right? And so I'm just encouraging you. I think it's more at the interpersonal level where you can help, which it seems that you already are doing, is to acknowledge the different kinds of suffering that they may articulate to you, but also be there for them in the small ways they need help. There's a lot of Afghans that weren't even told how to go grocery shopping here. They would get very small stipends and they would spend the entire thing in a 7-Eleven, not realizing that there's other grocery stores, right? That there's other ways, 7-Eleven, I don't know, I haven't been there in a while, but it's extremely expensive in terms of, and limited in terms of what you can get. So even those things, like, help asking the questions of where you go shopping and the little other ways that you can help. Don't underestimate the ways that you can help, and don't overestimate what you think that other social workers or stuff are doing, because they really don't know what they're doing with the Afghan arrivees since 2021. They have no support. They have no point person. Like I said, I work with them 3 times a week minimum. I have to go to PTA meetings. I have to go to all kinds of meetings, teacher meetings. They just, there's little to no support. They're on their own. So I would just encourage you to, offer things and put them in touch with resources that maybe even extend beyond medical help.
Thank you so much, Anila.
Sorry if that was limited, but I appreciate your question, Maria, and we could be in touch later.
I love that. Building connections right here in this virtual space. There were a couple comments or questions coming in, but in the chat, but let me again encourage people to use the raise hand function, or there are actually some wonderful people here in the room, physical room with me, who are welcome to ask questions as well. But let me just read one comment from Elizabeth, and then especially for those without the benefit of the chat in front of them, and then a question that follows. I agree 200%. There's no justice for the people of the world in the Caribbean, Africa, South America, Europe, Asia, and anywhere else I can think of, if the US never ever admits it did it for war's sake, not for morality, not for truth, but for militarism, racism, economic pariah, violence, and sexism. And then a question from Najat to all the panelists. Do you find it is true that American academics are seemingly opposed to any technological approach to the problems identified? Is the academy going to ever not be primarily linguistic? Broad question, and I would imagine that people could take it in a few directions, and wonder, Jenny, Maha, or Katalina, want to take that first?
I'm not sure I exactly understand the question. Is it more about, like, does academia have anything to offer in the way of practical interventions and solutions?
That's certainly the way I read it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's a great question, since you're at American University. And I think that is a problem that academia struggles with, right? First, how do we get out of the ivory tower and produce research that's actually going to be read by people that are impacted? Second, right, how do we produce research that isn't exploiting the people with whom or on whom the research is being done? And then third, I know in my experience, there was a lot of de-emphasis and in fact, negative connotations with, organizing and activism and academia. And if you brought in that further, it's about theory and practice. How do we bridge theory and practice? And that's not often being done in academia, right? And so the research can inform people, right? It can shape people's minds, but at the end of the day, like, how do we measure and how do we actually think about what would actually make change? So I'm not sure I have a super optimistic response to this question, but I think as most of you, I assume, are students, I think that is something you should push in your classes, in your research, right? How do I convert this theory to practice? And in some ways, it's very easy, right? You learn about impacted communities, right? There are ways to do this. And I'm sure Anila has actually a lot to say on this.
May I say something, or David, are we going to move on?
It looked like Katalina wanted to jump in and then maybe hold that thought for a moment.
I was just gonna say, add on to what Maha was saying, just seek out places where you can be in the room and listen and just find communities wherever makes the most sense for your vantage point. Just like push yourself out there, get out of your comfort zone. There are opportunities to connect with whatever cause you truly care about, and just be present and listen. Community building.
Danny, did you want to jump in, or should we turn to Anila?
My only thought is that at least the phrasing of this question, and I could be reading it wrong, seems to have a sort of binary between technological and linguistic. And I think that doesn't make sense to me. I think that there are many ways that you can be hands-on, practical, making a difference that are not technological.
And Anila, yeah.
I guess what I want to say is not it may be helpful to the students in your seminar, in the public anthropology seminar, but it may not be also. So apologies in advance. But for me, I think academia needs to be held accountable. There's several problems with academia for those of us who are in it and have been in it. For those aspiring to be in it, they must know the scope and intensity of how problematic it is. For me, I do think that anthropology as a discipline needs to be abolished. I'm currently writing a paper that is using Afghanistan as a case study to why anthropology needs to be abolished as a discipline. The kinds of work that they allowed to be published on Afghanistan during the 22 years and ongoing of just the latest war in Afghanistan, much less the 43 years of Syria war. The things that they demand of me as somebody who has been there and done 5 years of field work, right? Journals still ask me to provide evidence of harm, because that's the way that they tread in the necropolitical, because Afghans are only of value when they're dead, right? I'm currently also critiquing in a paper the Cost of War project and the entire project, and how they deal with Afghan lives as lives, and how they fetishize them in death, right? So for me, just the demand of me as an anthropologist that you need to go there. So I did that. And I didn't just stay for the compulsory 12 months or whatever for fuel. I stayed there for 5 years, because my project was far larger than my requirements for my PhD program or anything else, right? And yet, for journal articles, Yet still, I'm asked to provide evidence that harm was done to Afghans. When I'm trying to make a different point, theoretical point that engages with Afghans as humans, and that as important to the discipline of anthropology, if we want to understand what it means to be human in the contemporary, and their demand, like consistently, I'm not just talking about one journal or two or three, is that I need to provide evidence of harm because I was there. And I actually want to undo that whole idea that you need to be there. You need to be the witness that evidences harm and then comes back as the scribe who is part traumatized, part like spokesperson for the people. I have a problem with that vision and idea of anthropology that continues to persist, which is why I think the entire thing needs to be abolished and created anew. And when people hear abolish, they get all like, oh my God, right? Because abolish means to tear something down, and right, but they forget about the other part that's actually exciting. You start anew. You create and build something different and far better, right? And so for me, I do hold anthropology as a discipline accountable. I do hold academia accountable for its silences, and for the, even when it wasn't silenced, the way it participated in the fetishization of Afghan lives in death.
Thank you, Anila. We've got two questions. We have about 9 minutes left. So let's first turn to Isabel and then James.
Okay, sorry about that. Oh, that's so my question was more along the lines of how do you think the US versus other imperialist countries with like imperialist history sort of ended up in this role where they're essentially just like waging war? And I know that several European countries are also involved in the quote unquote war on terror, but obviously the US is the biggest aggressor.
I think what I'll do is then ask James to ask his question or their question, and then see what if one or more of the panelists wants to respond.
Oh, okay, there we go. Okay, so I have two questions. People can feel free to answer whichever one.
James, you look like you're unmuted, but can't hear you quite yet.
Oh, hello, can you hear me? Yeah.
No, unfortunately. So maybe you could put if you could put your question in the chat. I'm not sure why you are unmuted, but we're not hearing you.
I mean, okay.
I can hear you, James.
Great. Sorry, that was my
Others can.
technological problem.
Wait,
Thank you.
so should I ask it or
Yes.
should I just put it in the chat if they can't? Okay, whatever.
No, please do ask it, James. It was my fault. My technological incompetence, James. We could hear you, and
Oh,
it was
okay. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, great. So my two things. So one was how do we like abolish anthropology as a discipline, especially from within the discipline, rather than something like an outside force like contesting the academy itself, especially when people who are working within the discipline are usually reliant upon this for their own income. And then my other question was, what is like one concrete step that anyone here listening can take to, I mean, I guess materially and maybe ideologically push forward what has been discussed, like getting Afghans free passports or free education? Like how can we do something about that?
great questions. Thank you. We actually now have 3 questions on the table and only about 5.5 minutes. So if I could ask each of the panelists to respond to one of the questions perhaps, or offer and offer final thoughts in summation. So one of you who would like to go first? Jenny, I see you're unmuted.
Oh, that's an accident. I'm sorry. To answer your last question, and to sort of point to what Anila mentioned earlier, there are lots of Afghans and other people who were impacted by the war on terror here in the US as refugees, as parolees, maybe without status, who need help getting comfortable in this new place, who need help accessing resources. And I guarantee you that there is a resettlement agency or other organization near you that can use your volunteer hours and money if you have it. We certainly have families who we line people up to take someone to the grocery store and help teach them how to shop at Aldi instead of going to the more expensive local grocery store. To teach someone how to take the bus to their doctor's office, to help someone navigate how to deal with their kids being in school and pickup times and all of those things. There's so much that you can do to help someone in a sort of minute way. Not minute, but there's so much that you can do with your time to help an individual person.
Thank you, Jenny. Maha, Katalina, or Anila, want to jump in next?
I'll be quick. I know most of the questions that James posed were towards me. I want to just add on to what Jenny just said, right? Is there's plenty that could be done at just that's what I'm doing 3 times a week, is just taking people grocery shopping, introducing them to Costco, right? Right. It's and I would encourage you to employ not languages of charity and humanitarianism, but of reparations, and we owe you. And not because they served as minions to empire, because you served along US soldiers, because we destroyed your country, right? And even this is the stuff that we do in Switzerland when I do the mutual aid work, but they have so even like whether it's Costco or wherever you go shopping, they have rewards programs where you get money back, right? Pay that forward and give that to Afghan families. Right. So there's so many different ways where, and again, make sure that it's a language of reparations and that we owe you, not even the language of solidarity for mutual aid. When we have destroyed your country, it's not about solidarity, it's about we owe you. And so I would encourage that. With James' question about how do you
Anila, I wonder, just because we're about to run out of time, could maybe that's a question you could answer. I can connect you with James. I'm sure he would love
my email there. I was going to suggest that. My email I just shared, and connect, because that's not something that could be addressed in the time we have.
Thank you. Katalina, did you want to jump in next? I look like you were about to unmute.
Yeah, I guess I would just say that I think thinking that we need the academy to be successful is not a great assumption, because I think what we really are called to do right now is innovate, and there's just so many ways that you can like innovatively engage in, like I'm a teacher, so I'm able to like be paid but then pursue my interests on the side, and then I'm manifesting something eventually. So I don't think you need the academy, because that can really just narrow your entire worldview. Like, take what you can and like explore, be interdisciplinary and innovate. That's where you're going to become successful in the long run.
I love it. Thank you, Katalina. Maha.
Well, I don't think I have any responses to the question. I do want to read my poem if that's okay, but if there's no time, that's also okay.
Why don't you go ahead and read it? That would be powerful way to wrap us up. Although I will say, as Maha's reading, I'm going to put some links in the chat for people who want to get more involved. I would just point to one of many, and I would also encourage the other speakers to put links to important organizations they'd like to direct people to. I'll also make these links available to people who are watching online in the YouTube description. But Dissenters is one particularly powerful youth-led, mostly youth of color-led organization that is taking on militarism and war and the military-industrial complex, both at home and outside the United States. And I would encourage people to check out wearedissenters.org, wearedissenters.org, among many other wonderful organizations who are struggling for justice and building the kind of world that we want to see. Maha, thanks.
Okay. So this is a poem basically reflecting on the ways that the deaths of victims of U.S. state violence basically get no recognition and are erased and minimized. So the poem is called "Even Collateral Damage Deserves a Public Obituary." Another year down, and the only thing we can hear is silence about those killed in the war on terror. But never forget your lives, not ours, because we are the collateral damage that brings you security. Even though we are the forgotten ones, we remember the day after 9/11, our memories triggered by corpses left on the side of the road. Corpses that smell of blood but say nothing about freedom and democracy. Because your kind of freedom and democracy only comes to us with coffins. With our gravestones marking that our lives were lived, but that we had to die because you told us we hated freedom from the barrel of a gun. Most days, it feels like we died for your sins, whether it's colonialism, imperialism, or hegemony. We have been made to reap what you sowed. There are few that acknowledge our deaths, so this is a public obituary to let you know that our lives were stolen by the bombs that dropped on us, by the drones that striked us, by the bars that detained us, by the borders that adjudicated our humanity, by all the violence that rendered us disposable. This is a public obituary to remind the world that we will never forget our Afghan, Iraqi, Pakistani, Somali, Yemeni, Syrian, and our many other siblings that were terrorized and killed so you could tuck your kids safely in at night, while ours looked to the sky, correlating its color with the trepidation of more violence to come, under the guise of euphemized murder that you call collateral damage. That is, damage that isn't and will never be repaired by powers whose heels dug deeper into justifying our murders, a low threshold to bear. Because our murders are inconsequential numbers to your body counts that add up, even though we were never treated as lives to begin with. This is a public obituary with an announcement that our stories, spirits, and souls don't die when you kill us, because we are the ancestors that light the path forward with crimson red flames as a guide to those who survive us. Those who were taught by Zapata that it is better to die on our feet than to live on our knees. So we come bearing our truths with no holding back, no justice, no peace. Because if your violence and wars have already killed us, what do we have left to fear?
Thank you, Maha, for those powerful words. And I want to just thank all our panelists, Anila, Katalina, Jenny, Maha, for your work tonight and your work more broadly, working toward justice, and for all your insights that you shared with us. Thank you to everyone in the audience for the tremendous questions and comments and support that you offered. And thank you for being here. Thank you for the work you are all doing. And we look forward to working together more in the future. Thank you and have a good night. And we'll make this video available to all and hope that you share it with others and encourage others to get involved in the work of building a more just world. Thank you all.